On the 17th of April, 1942, the United States Army set fire to an American neighborhood in Arlington, Virginia, and burned it flat in a day. The last family had walked out the morning before. The next day's Washington Star carried a few paragraphs about it near the back of the paper, under a headline calling it a blitz. That was a strange word to reach for in the spring of 1942, because it was the word that paper had been using all winter for what the Germans were doing to English cities. The neighborhood was called Queen City. 9 weeks earlier, 903 people had been living there, in 218 households, on a wedge of about 30 acres between Columbia Pike and Arlington Ridge Road. They had 2 Baptist churches in brick, a trolley stop, groceries, barber shops, a shoe repair shop, a pool hall, a beer garden, a garage, and a volunteer fire company they had organized themselves, because no other fire company in the county would come when a black family's house was burning. What they did not have was running water. It came up the hill in buckets from a spring on the grounds of Arlington National Cemetery. They had been there for 50 years. They were given until the 1st of March. The letters went out in the first week of February, 28 days, in a segregated county where a black family could legally buy a house in about 3 places, and where every one of those 3 places was already full. William Allan was 12 years old that February. He is 95 now, and he is still saying the name out loud. The building people picture when they think about this ground never touched Queen City. The Pentagon went up on the other side of the fence, and the residents watched it rise for 4 months without being told a word. What took their houses was the road system. That is the mechanism of this story, and it is simpler and worse than a conspiracy. Nobody in Washington sat down and decided to destroy Queen City. Somebody set a completion date, and the neighborhood was inside the shape the schedule made. One thing more, and none of it lands without it. Most of those families had already been moved once. Not their ancestors in the abstract, their grandparents by the same government, off ground a mile away within living memory. The first time, they were given 90 days. The government that took Queen City in 1942 had already taken the ground these families came from, and the first taking was supposed to be a gift. In December of 1863, the federal government established a settlement for people escaping slavery on the confiscated estate of Robert E. Lee, directly across the river from an unfinished capital. They called it Freedman's Village. It was about 50 duplex houses, each one split to hold 2 families, laid out in rows on ground that is now Arlington National Cemetery, the Navy Annex site, and the northern edge of the Pentagon Reservation. It was built for roughly 600 people. Within a few years, more than 1,000 were living in it. It had a hospital, a chapel, workshops, a home for the aged, a school teaching both children and adults, and an industrial school meant to turn field labor into trades. Sojourner Truth worked there for about a year. It also had a rent. Residents earned $10 a month, and the government deducted $5 of that as a contraband tax, then charged between $1 and $3 for the house. A family cleared $2 to $4 a month and paid rent to the United States for a house the United States had built on land it had seized while the war that freed them was still being fought. They stayed anyway, and they built the things people build when they intend to remain. A Baptist congregation formed in 1866 under a minister named Robert Simon Laws, meeting in a building the villagers called the Old Bell Church. A lodge of the Oddfellows opened in 1870. In 1873, that Baptist congregation split in 2, and the 2 new churches were named Mount Olive and Mount Zion. And both of those names matter later, because both of those congregations are still meeting in Arlington. The government wanted the ground back almost immediately. The first attempt to close the village came in the winter of 1868, and the residents organized and beat it. Then the ownership of the whole estate went to the Supreme Court, because Robert E. Lee's son had sued to get it back, and in 1882 the court found for him, which meant that for a few months, the freed families at Arlington were living on land the highest court in the country had just returned to the family that had enslaved some of them. Congress solved that by buying the estate outright in 1883 for $150,000, and the purchase settled the question of who owned the ground under their houses. It was not them. On the 7th of December, 1887, the Army told them they had 90 days to leave. That notice was suspended 2 days later, and the village went on losing houses through the 1890s, and the last of it was gone by 1900. What the residents got instead was a settlement, and the same arithmetic runs through everything that follows. A man named John B. Swyfax fought for it. He had been born free, He had sat in the Virginia House of Delegates, and in 1888 he wrote to the Secretary of War, arguing that the people at Arlington had improved the property with their own hands and should be paid for what they had built. He asked for $350 for every homeowner on the estate. Congress eventually appropriated $75,000 in total. It was calculated as the appraised value of the dwellings, using an appraisal from 1868, plus a refund of the contraband tax that had by then been ruled illegal. Spread across the population, it came to about $103 a head, and some residents received nothing at all. Then the ground went to the Department of Agriculture, which turned it into the Arlington Experimental Farm. And if you want to know how tightly this story loops, that farm is the exact site a brigadier general would demand for the Pentagon 41 years later. The people scattered into the places a black family could buy land in Virginia at the turn of the century: Green Valley, Halls Hill, Johnson's Hill, Butler Homes, Ballston. And on the 12th of August, 1892, the trustees of Mount Olive Baptist Church bought 2 acres of ground east of where the village had stood, platted it into lots, and sold those lots to their own congregation. They named it Queen City. 12 years later, in October of 1904, a developer platted a neighboring subdivision of about 27 acres alongside it. Arlington County recorded that one as East Arlington, and over the following years, African-American families bought those lots too. On the county's maps, and on the 1935 property atlas, the whole wedge is labeled East Arlington. The people who lived there called all of it Queen City. Everything I am about to describe about that neighborhood is what the road plan would later classify as an obstruction. Start with what it did not have. No electricity in most of the houses, no gas mains, no water pipes, and no sewers under the streets. No curbs, no gutters, no sidewalks, no streetlights. Columbia Pike and Arlington Ridge Road, which ran along 2 edges of the neighborhood, were paved because they were county through routes. Inside Queen City, the streets were packed dirt. One street, 9th Street, had gravel on top of the dirt, and the county came round periodically and sprayed the gravel with oil to keep the dust down. That is the complete municipal history of 9th Street. The houses were 1 and 2 stories, timber frame, sitting on a concrete pad or straight on the dirt, with a few in brick. A living room, a kitchen, 2 bedrooms. Front porches, back porches, and on some of the better houses, a screened porch running round the side. Wood stoves in the kitchens and ice boxes beside them, and the man who delivered the ice lived in the neighborhood. There were outhouses in the yards, and county crews came round to empty them. For water, the families walked to that spring on the grounds of Arlington National Cemetery and carried it home. Some houses had a well in the backyard, but nobody drank from the wells. Eddie Corbin grew up there, and he remembered a big pear tree standing over that spring, and how in season the fruit dropped into the water, and how they were the best pears he ever tasted. The spring is the one thing on this ground that outlasts everything else in this story. The 1940 census counted 903 people in 218 households. 90 of those households owned their homes outright at an average value of $1,765. 128 households rented at an average of $15 a month. 130 people were lodging in houses with families they were not related to, which tells you the neighborhood was taking in workers who could not find a room anywhere else in the county. 903 is a floor and not a total. It is a census count, taken 2 years before anybody was told to leave, in a place where more than 100 people were sleeping in rooms rented off somebody else, which is exactly the population an enumerator misses. It is the best figure anyone has, and it is almost certainly low. It is the number everything in this story gets measured against because it is the only number anybody ever wrote down. The average resident was 29 years old. 105 of the 903 were children of 5 or younger. A young, crowded, working neighborhood without a single amenity the county gave itself for free. And that combination was not an accident either. It was policy, and the policy is the reason there was nowhere for these people to go when the letters came. The reason there was nowhere to go was written down, decades earlier, in the deeds. Deeds across Northern Virginia carried restrictive covenants, clauses written into the paperwork of a house forbidding its sale to anyone who was not white. They were not fringe documents. They were standard, they were enforceable, and they covered most of the new subdivisions going up around Washington through the 1920s and 30s. Where the covenants did not reach, zoning and lending practice did. In 1900, African Americans were 38% of Arlington County's population. By 1950, they were 5%. Nothing about that collapse was voluntary. The effect was arithmetic rather than atmosphere. Black Arlington was compressed into a handful of places, and by the 1940s, it was essentially 3. Green Valley, Johnson's Hill, and Hall's Hill. Every one of them was neglected in exactly the way Queen City was neglected, with unpaved streets and no lights and no gutters, because a county allocates public works to the voters it is worried about. And in the 1930s, on the boundary between the white neighborhood of Woodlawn and Black Halls Hill, somebody built a wall. Wood, brick, and cement, running along the property line, put up for no purpose except to stop people crossing. It is generally called the segregation wall, and Arlington kept it for decades. Dr. Scott Taylor, who runs the Black Heritage Museum of Arlington, was asked a few years ago why a neighborhood of 218 households needed a fire company of its own. His answer was that they had to have one, because if something was on fire, no other fire department was coming. These families were operating in a market, not a market with poor options, a market with 3 addresses in it, and the whole load-bearing assumption of what the War Department did in 1942 was that people could simply find somewhere else. Inside that box, the community was the asset, and by the late 1930s, Queen City was building like it planned to be there for another century. The work came from the bottom of the hill. Where Columbia Pike runs down to meet the Potomac, there was a strip of industry, and 101 men from the neighborhood worked in it, 82 of them at the West Brothers Brickyard, 11 at a coal yard, 6 at a concrete plant, 2 at an oil refinery. Stop on that brickyard for a second. Those 82 men were making the bricks for the Washington suburbs they were not permitted to live in. Around that wage came everything else. Boarding houses took in the out-of-town men who worked the same industries. Women cooked meals at home, carried them down to the plants at midday, and sold them. The groceries, the barbers, the shoe repair shop, the pool hall and the garage all ran on money that came back up the hill in the evening. The Oddfellows Lodge made small loans to members and put on an entertainment every Christmas. The children walked out of the neighborhood every morning and up Columbia Pike to a segregated school because Queen City had no school of its own, and Arlington was in no hurry to build one for it. And the churches got ambitious. Mount Zion, the older of the two, whose congregation traced back to that church founded in Freedman's Village in 1866, put up a new building on Arlington Ridge Road in 1930. Mount Olive, the church that had bought the original 2 acres, went further. In about 1939, the congregation of a neighborhood with no running water and no electric light finished a new church of brick and marble in the geographical center of Queen City. Sit with that sequence. These were families whose grandparents had been moved out of a government village with about $100 each. 2 generations later, in a place the county would not pave, they had built a marble church. Here is the last Christmas anybody had in Queen City. The lodge entertainment ran in the last weeks of December every year, and the members who had paid their dues collected their tickets at the door, and the last of those nights fell in 1941. Down the hill, the brickyard was shut for the holiday. Both churches were full that Sunday, one of them 3 winters old. And when the entertainment finished, the people in that room walked home through streets with nothing lit in them, 6 weeks before the letters came. 903 people, in a place with no streetlights, running everything they needed. They had the marble church for 3 years. 9 months after the last stone went in, a general in Washington needed somewhere to put a building. He gave the architects a weekend. Watch how fast the next part goes. It is the same speed, run out of the same office, that was about to be applied to the neighborhood next door. On Thursday, the 17th of July, 1941, Brigadier General Somerville, the Army's chief of construction, told his design staff he wanted drawings for a single building large enough to hold the entire War Department, and he wanted them on his desk on Monday morning. The department had outgrown the munitions building and was renting offices all over Washington. He was not interested in a phased plan. He wanted one building, and he wanted it faster than anybody had ever built one. The site he chose was the Arlington Experimental Farm, about 400 acres of Department of Agriculture land on high ground above the river, immediately south of Arlington National Cemetery. It was the old Freedman's Village ground. That plot was bounded on 5 sides by roads and a railway line and a line of trees, and the architects drew a 5-sided building to fit inside it. The shape of the Pentagon comes from that outline, not from symbolism and not from defense, from a fence line on a farm. Then the President of the United States objected in public at a press conference on the 19th of August. Roosevelt did not like the size of it, and he did not like where it was going. He had helped put temporary buildings on the National Mall during the First World War, and he described that as a crime for which he ought to be kept out of heaven, and he was not about to repeat it below Arlington House. On the 26th of August, He called the officials in and told them he preferred a site further south. On the 29th, he got into a car and toured both sites himself with Somerville and the director of the budget. And when the general kept arguing for the farm, the president overruled him on the spot. The building moved about a mile downriver, onto low, wet ground the locals called Hell's Bottom. Brickyards, industrial sheds, old whiskey stills, and part of the abandoned Washington Hoover Airport. The five-sided design came with it because there was no time to draw another one. Roosevelt's intervention is remembered as an act of taste, and on its own terms it was one. It protected the view from the Lee Mansion and the cemetery. It also moved the largest office building in the world to within a few hundred yards of the front doors of Queen City, and nobody in that meeting mentioned Queen City. Because on the plans that were on the table that afternoon, the building still did not touch it. The building never did touch it. Something else was already being drawn. Ground was broken on the 11th of September, 1941, the same day the contract was approved, and work started that afternoon and did not stop for a year and a half. The ground was river silt, so the building had to be floated on piles, and the crews drove 41,492 of them. Pile drivers ran 24 hours a day for roughly a year. 680,000 tons of sand and gravel were dredged out of the Potomac to make the concrete. The contractor was John McShane of Philadelphia, who had put up the Jefferson Memorial and the National Airport. The Army's man on site was Colonel Leslie Groves, who left the job to run the Manhattan Project. 7 months from that first pile, the Army burned the neighborhood on the other side of the fence. By March of 1942, there were more than 13,000 men working on it. On the 30th of April, 1942, the first 1,500 employees moved into a building that was still half a construction site and walked to their desks over boards. The building was dedicated on the 15th of January, 1943, 16 months after the first shovel, at a cost of about $83 million, covering 29 acres of ground. The building was drawn over a weekend, cited by an argument in a moving car, and occupied while the roof was still going on. A government working like that does not slow down for 218 households, and it did not. Now do the part of the arithmetic that everybody skips. A building holding 35,000 people in Arlington in 1942 is not an office. It is a daily migration. Every one of those workers had to arrive in the morning and leave at night, in a country where the automobile had just one, on a riverbank served by 2 country roads and a trolley line. So the plan included 67 acres of parking, and it included a road network of more than 30 miles of highway and ramps with 21 overpasses, built by the Public Roads Administration at a cost of around $7 million. Grading started in October of 1941, 1 month after the building. At the center of it went a cloverleaf, one of the first large cloverleaf interchanges built anywhere in the United States, sitting directly in front of the Pentagon's western face, taking Columbia Pike and folding it into the highway. The building missed Queen City. The parking missed Queen City. The cloverleaf did not. And the men in the room knew that in October of 1941, 4 months before anybody in the neighborhood was told a word. In that month, the road plan went before the National Capital Planning Commission, and a highway consultant working on the project, Jay Downer, explained to the commission what the new network would achieve. According to the record of that meeting, he told them it took out some troublesome slave cabins, and that it cleaned up that strip. The word he used for the people living in those houses was a racial slur. Cleaning up that strip is the euphemism. It is planning language, the kind of phrase that turns up in 1,000 mid-century road reports. And stripped of the vocabulary, it means demolishing 218 occupied houses. The slur is not a euphemism at all. It is a description of who lived in those houses, delivered as a selling point in a public meeting of a federal planning body in the capital of a country that was 2 months away from entering a war against a racial state. Nobody at that meeting objected. The plan went forward. Meanwhile, half a mile away, men from Queen City were working on the Pentagon site. Some were on the crews, others had enlisted. The whole neighborhood could hear the pile drivers going through the night, and what they thought they were watching was a job. A man named Allan, quoted in the Washington Star in 1975, put it about as plainly as anyone ever has. They just thought the government was building a building over in the field. They had no idea it was going to be as big as it was. And then they came to building the roads, and that was when they took all the houses. The roads had a schedule, and the schedule had a completion date, and everything that happens from here is that date arriving. Construction was due to reach East Arlington on the 19th of January, 1942. The date was written into the program. The War Department did not write to anybody in January. It waited until the first week of February. Then letters went out to the property owners telling them that their land was being taken by eminent domain and that they had to be out of their houses by the 1st of March. Here is what the record does not contain: any hearing at which a resident of Queen City was heard, any published route alternative, any relocation office, any rehousing program, any figure quoted to any family at the time. What arrived was a decision that had been taken in October and a date in March. Gertrude Jeffress, who was living there, described what that felt like in one sentence that has survived. "It was a predicament," she said. "Where in the world were we going to find a place to live?" 28 days. The government of the United States considered that a reasonable interval between telling a family that their house was gone and expecting the house to be empty. The crews did not wait for the 28 days either. The Pentagon needed a sewer connection, and Queen City had never been on the county sewer system, so the trench for the Pentagon's line was cut straight through the middle of an occupied neighborhood. One resident described it afterwards. "They started work before anyone moved. They came right up 8th Street and dug a trench, and that trench ran from where the Pentagon is now all the way up to Fort Myer, and they were not kidding around because it was right out the front door. There was nowhere to go, and that is not a figure of speech." In the spring of 1942, the Washington region was in the worst housing shortage in its history, with war workers arriving by the trainload from every state in the country, and the only housing legally available to a black family in Arlington was in Green Valley, Johnson's Hill, or Hall's Hill, all of which were already carrying more people than they had houses. The people who tried to help had almost no leverage. The Reverend Mackley of Mount Olive stationed himself at the county courthouse, gathering whatever information he could get and passing it back to his congregation, and other ministers did the same. Then the neighborhood did one thing that week that nobody expected of it. It found the money for a lawyer. The county board met and produced a motion. The chairman, Edmund Campbell, moved to authorize a county officer to do what he could for those forced to move, compatible with the best interests of the county, and to prevent unnecessary hardship wherever possible. Read that motion in plain English. It authorizes one man to be helpful, as long as being helpful costs the county nothing, in whatever way he personally judges appropriate. For a family with 28 days and 3 legal addresses, that is nothing at all. The war was real. Pearl Harbor had been attacked 9 weeks before those letters went out. The United States was losing in the Pacific. The War Department was running a global war out of rented office space scattered across a city, and the case for putting it under one roof as fast as physically possible was not a pretext. It was correct. The roads were real too. 35,000 people genuinely could not be delivered to that building on 2 country roads. When the House Military Affairs Committee held a hearing on the 13th of February 1942, the head of the War Department's Roads Bureau told the committee that the work was a matter of split-second timing and that any delay would be very serious. The Washington Post reported the department's position the following day. The roads had to be finished by the time the new building opened that November. None of what follows is an argument that the building should not exist. Every one of those statements is defensible. Not one of them explains the thing that actually decided this, which is the calendar. The road plan was public in October. The construction date was set for January. The letters went out in February. Somebody had 4 months in which they could have told the people who lived there and used none of it. And the reason was not military secrecy, because the plan had been discussed openly in front of a planning commission. They did not tell them earlier because telling them earlier would have produced objections earlier, and objections cost days. Nothing inside Arlington was going to stop this. The only thing that ever slowed it down came from outside the county entirely. The attorney wrote to Eleanor Roosevelt. She read it and sent it on to the House Military Affairs Committee. For about a day, it looked as though the letter had reached exactly the right desk. On the 12th of February, the Washington Star ran the story under a headline about a House unit hearing the plea of families facing ouster, and the hearing was held the next morning. What the First Lady of the United States was able to obtain, on behalf of 903 people about to lose their homes in wartime, was 1 additional month, and permission for the Army to put up trailers. That was the ceiling. The maximum available political intervention in the country bought exactly that. Not a hearing on the route, not a review of the plan, not $1 for the renters, 30 extra days, and a caravan. Set that against the fact that the entire building went up in 16 months. The Army built the trailer villages on vacant ground in Green Valley and Johnson's Hill, which is to say on the 2 other black neighborhoods in the county, which is to say that the county's black population was compressed further into the same 3 addresses. They did the work properly as far as it went. They leveled the ground where it needed leveling. They laid water lines and sewer lines, which is more than Queen City ever got in 50 years. They built men's and women's bathhouses and a laundry and a community building. They put down wooden sidewalks between the rows, small trailers for small families and larger trailers for larger ones. Families registered and moved in as each trailer was connected. The trailers did not arrive as fast as the houses emptied, and that gap is where the worst of this lives. Families doubled up with relatives in Green Valley. Others found whatever they could. One family of 9, 4 of them children, spent 4 months living in a shed with a dirt floor. Everything that family owned was lost except the mother's 4-poster bed. There was no room in an army trailer for furniture, clothes, dishes, pots, and pans. Everything else, the porch chairs and the beds and the pianos and the photographs and the tools, was left in the houses because there was nowhere to put it and no money to move it. The last families walked out of Queen City in the first week of April 1942. The following day, the Army burned it. The whole 30 acres, 218 houses, the groceries, the barber shops, the pool hall, the beer garden, the fire company's shed, Mount Zion's church of 1930, Mount Olive's marble church, 3 years old. 50 years of a place, on ground its founders had bought with their own money in 1892, gone in an afternoon. With the smoke visible from the windows of the building, the whole thing had been done for. The Washington Star gave it a few paragraphs. The fire is not where the record stops. What the government thought Queen City had been worth was written down separately, in one line, in a deed book in the County Land Records Office. The Fifth Amendment says that private property shall not be taken for public use without just compensation. It does not define just compensation, and it never has. In practice, in 1942, it meant the value of the land and the buildings on it assessed by the buyer, which in this case was the party doing the taking. The War Department did not deal with families. It filed one deed with the Arlington County Land Records Office, Deed Book 575, page 370, and that deed specified a single flat sum for the entire neighborhood, $369,427. One number for everything. The houses, the churches, the shops, the lots, the whole 50 years. The money was handed to Arlington County, and the county was left to divide it among the property owners. Reporting on the taking has since divided that sum among roughly 180 owners, which works out at about $2,052 each. Now look at what that sum was not for. It was not for moving expenses. Nobody was paid a cent to shift their possessions, which is why the possessions were still in the houses that were burned. It was not for the loss of what was inside those houses. Not one item of furniture was compensated. It was not for business losses. The groceries, the barber shops, the shoe repair shop, the garage, the pool hall, and the beer garden were assessed as buildings and land, and their owners were paid for the structure and nothing for the trade. None of those businesses was ever rebuilt anywhere. Every one of them simply stopped existing in April of 1942, and it was not, in any amount, for the 128 households who rented. More than half the households in Queen City were tenants. Under the law as it stood, a tenant owns no property, so a tenant loses no property, so a tenant is owed nothing. 128 families were moved out of their homes by the federal government, watched those homes burn, and received no compensation of any kind because the Constitution protects the deed rather than the household. Neither were the 101 men from the brickyard and the coal yard and the refinery, whose employers were being cleared for the same road system, and who lost the job and the house in the same month. Set the whole thing against the settlement their grandparents got. In 1900, the government closed Freedman's village and paid about $103 a head, and the calculation it used was a valuation from 32 years earlier. In 1942, the government closed Queen City and paid one flat number to a county office, with nothing for renters, nothing for possessions, nothing for trade, and nothing for wages. 42 years apart, on two pieces of ground about a mile from each other, the same institution wrote a check that covered the buildings and skipped the people, and got faster at it. William Vollin's family went into the camps. He has said since that they were left devastated with no place to go, and that he went from one trailer camp to another trailer camp in filthy conditions. The trailer camps were supposed to be temporary. They stood for about 4 years. The middle of this century does not happen in Queen City, because Queen City was gone before it started. It happens in 2 caravan parks on borrowed ground. The federal government sent a photographer. In April of 1942, the Farm Security Administration dispatched Marjorie Collins to document the trailer camp, and she made 24 photographs that are in the Library of Congress. The well-equipped laundry in the community building, the interior of an expansible trailer, showing the kitchen and the couch that converts into a bed for 4. A girl preparing vegetables outside a single-type trailer. The manager going over the rental plan with his secretary. A general view of the whole site taken from the roof of the community building. The photographs are careful, well-lit, and entirely without irony. They are a record of a government solving a problem made by the same government that had created the problem 8 weeks earlier. John Henderson, who lived in one of those trailers, remembered rats large enough to shake the floorboards. He also said it was quite a trying time, and that the love and association of people was what kept people together, and that he sometimes thanked the Lord he had been raised in that community. But the community was no longer in one place, and that is the loss no line item covers. Families went to Green Valley and Johnson's Hill and Hall's Hill. Others went to Bailey's Crossroads or Merrifield, or across the river into the district. The residents Nancy Perry interviewed 70 years later kept returning to the same point in different words, that it was never the same, that there was no community afterwards because people went here and there and everywhere, that some of those people you never did see again. The institutions made it. In 1944, Mount Zion opened a new church on South 19th Street, designed by Romulus Archer, the second African-American architect licensed in Washington. That same year, Mount Olive laid the cornerstone of a new building on what is now South 13th Road and moved in. Both congregations had now been displaced twice in 70 years, out of Freedman's Village and out of Queen City, and both of them rebuilt. And in 1950, the census takers went round Arlington County and East Arlington was not there. It has no entry. 8 years after the fire, the neighborhood had stopped being a place that got counted, and it has never appeared on a county map since. Inside the building, something else had been running the whole time. The Pentagon was built in Virginia, and Virginia law required separate facilities for black and white people in public buildings. So the architects drew it that way, segregated cafeterias, and roughly twice the number of lavatories the building actually needed. Roosevelt visited during construction, noticed how many lavatories there were, and the whites-only signs came down. In May of 1942, a black ordnance worker refused to take his lunch in the basement cafeteria set aside for him, and a security guard clubbed him on the head. The incident was investigated, and an order went out desegregating the Pentagon's cafeterias. Virginia did not repeal its segregation statutes until 1965. For 23 years, the Pentagon was the only public building in the Commonwealth of Virginia where those laws were not enforced. The building was the exception to Virginia's color line. The road in front of it had been laid across 903 black residents, and there is no evidence that anybody inside ever connected the two facts. Outside the fence, the line held exactly where it had always been. The children who had carried water up from that spring were adults by then, scattered across the county and across the river, and it was their children who walked into the next part. On the 2nd of February, 1959, 4 black children walked into Stratford Junior High School in North Arlington. Ronald Deskins, Lance Newman, Michael Jones, and Gloria Thompson. They were the first black students to enter a white public school anywhere in the state of Virginia, and the local papers later called it the day nothing happened, because nothing did. About Queen City, nothing happened at all for a very long time. There was no marker, there was no plaque. The Pentagon's own published history did not mention Queen City. The road network was renumbered, widened, and rebuilt, and the cloverleaf was resurfaced and re-signed and carried a rising volume of traffic every year for 8 decades, and none of it was ever labeled. 33 years after the fire, in September of 1975, the Washington Star ran a piece with former residents in it, and then it went quiet again for another generation. The recovery of this started with somebody deciding the count mattered. In 2004, the journalist Steve Vogel interviewed the woman who had called it a predicament while researching a history of the Pentagon, and her account went into the book he published 3 years later. Then, in 2012 and 2013, the geographer Nancy Perry went round Arlington, sat in the front rooms of 9 surviving residents of Queen City, and asked them what had happened, and then went into the land records office and the census returns and worked out what had been taken. Her paper appeared in the journal Urban Geography, and here is what it argues. What the government compensated, she wrote, were the tangible things, land and buildings, at a price the government set. What it destroyed was a community of the kind that runs on dependency rather than contract, where people cut each other's hair, minded each other's children, sold each other groceries, and carried each other's water. And that kind of community, once it is scattered, cannot be reassembled and was never priced. There is one detail in the way she published it that stops you. To protect the confidentiality of the 9 people who let her into their houses, She gave each of them an invented name, and every quotation in the paper is attributed to one of those invented names. Her acknowledgments thank the real people. The quotations do not carry them. So the fullest account of what happened to Queen City, the one built out of the census returns and the deed books and the front rooms, still reaches the public with the residents' names detached from the things they said, 70 years after the county stopped listing the neighborhood at all. In 2023, at Metropolitan Park in Arlington, about a mile from the ground itself, an artist named Nikisha Durrett finished a monument to Queen City. It is 35 feet high and 15 feet wide, a cylindrical brick tower faced with about 5,000 reclaimed bricks, built in the shape of an above-ground well, because the neighborhood had carried its water from a spring. You walk in at the bottom. Hanging inside, from the top of the shaft to the bottom, are 903 ceramic vessels shaped and colored like drops of water, made by 17 black ceramicists from 11 states. One vessel for every resident the census managed to count. William Allan, who was 12 when the letters came, went to the opening, and one of the 903 is his. In January of 2025, Arlington's Historical Review Board approved the wording for a cast aluminum marker, worked out with the Black Heritage Museum of Arlington, to stand at the southeast corner of Army-Navy Drive and South Joyce Street. The marker was unveiled in June of 2025. On the 13th of May, 2025, the Arlington County Board formally acknowledged what had been done and expressed regret for the county's own part in it. The chair of the board said that Arlington should have done more and that the recognition was long overdue. William Allan, then 94 years old, told the board that he framed it as an atrocity. Queen City was erased in 28 days because the road network had a completion date and the people standing on it had no way to cost anybody a single day. That is the whole of it. Not a policy about slums, not a theory about cities, not a plan for anything at all. A schedule, a fence line, and 903 people who happened to be inside the shape it made. Drive it now. Come down Columbia Pike toward the river, past the shopping centers and the towers of Pentagon City, and let the road do what it was built to do, which is to curl you round the cloverleaf and set you down at the western face of the Pentagon. You will not slow down. There is nothing to see. Grass on the embankments, a guardrail, and the traffic doing 60. Somewhere under that curve is the spring the children carried water from, and the pear tree that stood over it. The cloverleaf is still there, still carrying the traffic it was built to carry. Mount Zion is still meeting on South 19th Street, and Mount Olive is still meeting on South 13th Road. And both are congregations that have now been moved twice by the government of the United States and have outlasted every office that moved them. William Allan is still saying the name out loud. And a mile from where the houses stood, there is a brick tower shaped like a well, with 903 drops of water hanging inside it, in a park, beside a corporate campus, on ground Queen City never owned. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button in the middle to watch more forgotten places and abandoned history from across America. Then click the video on the left to watch similar stories like this. Or if you really want to get stuck in, click the playlist on the right. New videos every week. I'll see you in the next one.